Hello, friends. Welcome back to Whispers of Time. Today's story is about failure, real failure. The kind that drains your bank account, damages your confidence, and makes you question who you are. It's about a young entrepreneur who lost everything he built, faced debt and shame, and hit the lowest point of his life. But this is also a story about rebuilding, step by step, mistake by mistake, and turning that collapse into lasting success. Let's begin. I was 27 years old when I experienced real failure for the first time. Not the kind of failure where you lose a game. Not the kind where you fail a test and try again next week. I'm talking about the kind of failure that empties your bank account, damages your confidence, and makes you question who you are. At that time, I believed I was building my future. I had launched a small marketing startup. I invested everything I had saved over 3 years. On top of that, I borrowed money from my parents. I made spreadsheets. I calculated projected revenue. I told myself that within 3 months, the business would be profitable. On paper, everything made sense. In reality, nothing worked. The first month was quiet. I told myself it was normal. Businesses need time, I said. The second month, I spent even more money on advertising. I convinced myself that visibility would solve everything. By the third month, my bank account was nearly empty. No steady clients, no stable income. Rent for the office due. Salaries for 2 employees waiting. And then the messages from the bank started coming. I remember sitting alone in that office one evening. The lights were off except for my laptop screen. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. My heart felt heavy. My mind kept repeating one question. What have I done? The worst part wasn't losing money. The worst part was facing people. My parents believed in me. My friends told me I was brave. I had spoken confidently about building something big. And now I could barely cover basic expenses. That's when I made my first big mistake clear to myself. I had built a business based on confidence, not research. I never truly studied the market. I assumed people needed my service. I overestimated demand. I underestimated costs. And I had no financial safety net. 3 months later, I closed the business. I sold the desks and chairs at half price. I terminated the office lease. I paid my employees with the last of my remaining funds. The day I handed over the keys, I felt something collapse inside me. It wasn't just a company shutting down. It felt like my identity was shutting down. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the dark. For weeks after that, I avoided phone calls. I ignored messages. I stopped posting online. I didn't want anyone asking, "How's the business going?" Because there was no business. That period was the lowest point of my life. I started waking up late. I stopped exercising. I ate badly. I felt ashamed. Every time I saw someone my age succeeding, it felt like proof that I was behind. One morning, I looked at myself in the mirror. Dark circles under my eyes, unshaven face, tired expression. And I realized something dangerous was happening. I was no longer just someone who failed at business. I was becoming someone who believed he was a failure. That was the turning point. If I stayed in that mindset, I knew I would never try again. So I did something uncomfortable. I took a notebook and forced myself to answer 3 questions honestly. Why did I fail? What exactly did I do wrong? What would I change if I started again? I didn't allow excuses. I wrote, I didn't validate the market. I spent too much too early. I hired employees before having stable revenue. I made emotional decisions instead of strategic ones. I didn't ask experienced entrepreneurs for advice. Writing those words hurt. But it was the first time I separated emotion from reality. Failure was no longer a vague, dark cloud. It became a list of specific mistakes, and specific mistakes can be corrected. I still had debt. That didn't disappear. So instead of trying to launch another business immediately, I got a regular job. It was humbling. 6 months earlier, I had introduced myself as a founder. Now I was an employee again. My ego suffered, but I stayed quiet and worked. Every month, I paid off part of my debt. But here's what changed. After work, instead of watching shows or scrolling through social media, I studied. I took online marketing courses. I learned about customer acquisition properly. I studied budgeting and cash flow management. I read case studies of failed startups, not just successful ones. And something became clear. The people who eventually succeeded weren't smarter than me. They just analyzed their failures instead of personalizing them. They treated failure like data. So I decided that if I ever started again, I would do it differently. 6 months passed. My debt reduced significantly. My confidence slowly started returning. Not because I was succeeding, but because I was improving. This time I didn't rush. I researched a specific niche market. I spoke directly to potential customers. I asked them what problems they were actually struggling with. I didn't pitch anything. I just listened. I noticed patterns, common frustrations, repeated complaints, unmet needs. Instead of launching a full company again, I started small. No office, no employees, no large expenses. I worked from home. I offered one focused service to one specific type of client. And then something happened that felt small, but meant everything. My first client paid me. It wasn't a large amount, but it was validation. This time, someone paid not because I hoped they would, but because I had identified a real need. I was cautious. Every dollar earned, I tracked carefully. Every expense I questioned, every strategy I tested before scaling. There were still problems. Some clients left, some campaigns failed, some months were slow. But this time, I didn't collapse emotionally. When something didn't work, I asked, why? I adjusted, I refined, I improved. I stopped seeing obstacles as personal attacks. They were feedback. And slowly, steadily, income became consistent. Not explosive, not dramatic, but stable. About a year after shutting down my first business, I reached the same revenue level I had once dreamed about. But this time, the difference was internal. I wasn't arrogant. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't driven by ego. I was disciplined. The biggest lesson I learned during that journey wasn't about marketing or money. It was this: failure only becomes permanent when you attach it to your identity. Closing that first business didn't make me a failure. Quitting would have. Climbing out of that dark period wasn't about motivation. It was about structure, honest analysis, practical correction, consistent action. I didn't escape the bottom in one dramatic moment. I climbed out, step by step. And the person who stood at the top wasn't the same person who had fallen. He was stronger, more aware, and no longer afraid of failing again. Success did not feel the way I imagined it would. When the income became stable, I expected relief. I expected confidence. I expected that quiet voice of doubt to to finally disappear. Instead, something else happened. Responsibility grew. At first, I was working alone from home, managing a few clients, delivering results personally, controlling every detail. It was safe. It was predictable. But then, referrals started coming in. 1 client became 3. 3 became 7. 7 became more than I could handle alone. This is where many people think the story becomes easy. It didn't. The first major problem of growth hit me fast: time. I was waking up at 6 a.m., answering emails before breakfast, working through lunch, finishing projects past midnight. I told myself it was temporary. This is the price of growth, I said. But exhaustion doesn't negotiate. After 3 months of overwork, mistakes started happening. I missed deadlines. I sent incorrect reports. I forgot follow-ups. One afternoon, a long-term client called me. His voice was calm but direct. "We're not seeing the level of attention we had before." That sentence hit harder than any financial loss I had experienced, because this time it wasn't about failing at a startup. It was about failing after I had already rebuilt myself. For a moment, fear returned. What if I lose everything again? But this time I didn't shut down. I recognized the pattern. The problem wasn't effort. It was structure. I was trying to grow a business with the habits of a freelancer, so I did something I had been afraid to do since my first failure. I hired again, but this time, differently. Instead of renting an office and hiring quickly like before, I started with 1 remote assistant on a trial basis. Clear role, clear expectations, clear budget. I calculated exactly how much revenue was stable before committing to the expense. It felt uncomfortable. Delegating always does. At first, I wanted to control everything. I corrected small details obsessively. I rewrote tasks. I double-checked every email. But then I realized something important. If I didn't trust others, I would remain trapped at the same level. Growth required letting go of control, intelligently. Over the next few months, I documented every process in my business: how to onboard a client, how to launch a campaign, how to report results, how to handle complaints. I created systems. Not because I loved organization, but because I was afraid of chaos, and I had learned what chaos costs. Revenue increased again, slowly but steadily. With help, I could focus on strategy instead of minor tasks. But just as things began to stabilize, another challenge appeared: competition. The niche I had carefully researched was no longer quiet. Larger agencies noticed the same opportunity. They had bigger teams, bigger budgets, more brand recognition. Within 2 months, I lost 2 major clients to a larger competitor offering lower prices. Old fear whispered again, "You can't compete with them." This time, instead of reacting emotionally, I analyzed the situation. Why did the clients leave? It wasn't just price, it was perceived value. The larger agency had polished branding, detailed presentations, and case studies that looked impressive. My results were strong, but my positioning was weak, so I shifted focus. Instead of lowering prices, I improved perception. I invested in professional branding. I redesigned proposals. I collected video testimonials from satisfied clients. I built case studies showing measurable results. Then I made a strategic decision. I stopped trying to serve everyone. I narrowed my niche even further. Instead of marketing services, I specialized in one specific problem for one specific type of business. This made my messaging sharper, my authority clearer, my competition smaller. Within 6 months, something interesting happened. Instead of chasing clients, I began attracting better ones. Clients who valued specialization, clients who paid more, clients who respected boundaries. Revenue grew again, but this time with less stress. However, success brought a new internal battle: imposter syndrome. The higher I climbed, the more I feared being exposed. What if I just got lucky? What if I can't maintain this? What if the next failure is bigger? The irony of growth is that external success does not automatically create internal peace. So I worked on something I had ignored for years: my mindset. I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted clarity. In those sessions, I uncovered something surprising. My fear of failure wasn't about money, it was about identity. Growing up, I had tied my worth to achievement. If I succeeded, I felt valuable. If I failed, I felt ashamed. That pattern made every business fluctuation feel personal. Breaking that pattern was harder than rebuilding the company. But once I separated self-worth from results, something changed. I became calmer during slow months, more rational during setbacks, less reactive during criticism. And then came the moment that truly tested everything I had learned. An economic downturn hit the market. Clients reduced budgets, some paused campaigns, new inquiries slowed dramatically. Revenue dropped by nearly 40% in 3 months. Old panic tried to return, but I had data now. I reviewed expenses immediately, cut unnecessary costs, renegotiated contracts, offered adjusted service packages to retain clients instead of losing them completely. I communicated transparently. Instead of hiding, I reached out to every active client personally. That single decision preserved relationships that could have disappeared. The downturn lasted months, but I survived it, not because I was fearless, but because I was prepared. Looking back, I realized something critical. The first failure taught me humility. The rebuilding phase taught me discipline. Growth taught me leadership. Competition taught me positioning. Crisis taught me resilience. Success was not a single breakthrough moment. It was layers of correction. Each new level demanded a stronger version of me. And the most powerful realization of all? The person who once sat in a dark room, ashamed and broke, was still inside me. But now, instead of controlling me, he reminded me how far I had climbed. And this time, I knew something with certainty. Even if everything collapsed again, I knew how to rebuild. By the time the market stabilized, I was no longer trying to prove myself. I was trying to build something sustainable. The business had survived pressure, competition, and an economic downturn. Revenue was healthy again. The team had grown to 5 people. Systems were in place. Clients were consistent. From the outside, it looked like success. But internally, I faced a different question. How big do I really want this to become? Because growth has a hidden cost. The larger we expanded, the more decisions depended on me. Hiring, strategy, financial forecasting, conflict resolution, legal structure, partnerships. Every mistake at this level would be bigger than the ones I made at 27. One evening, I stayed alone in my office after everyone left. I looked at the numbers. We had the opportunity to scale aggressively. A potential investor had shown interest. Expansion into a new market was possible. Projected revenue could triple within a year. 3 years earlier, I would have said yes immediately. This time, I paused. I asked myself a question I had never asked before. Am I chasing growth or building stability? Because I remembered something clearly. My first collapse happened not because of lack of ambition, but because of uncontrolled ambition. So instead of rushing into expansion, I did something that felt almost boring. I slowed down. I hired a financial advisor. I built a 12-month cash reserve. I stress-tested the business model under worst-case scenarios. I ran projections assuming revenue would drop 30%. Only after those numbers made sense did I move forward. We expanded, but strategically, not into 5 new markets, into 1. Not by doubling the team overnight, by adding 2 carefully selected specialists, not by chasing every opportunity, by focusing on the most profitable and stable segment. Growth became controlled instead of explosive, and then something unexpected happened. For the first time since starting this journey, I felt calm, not excited, not anxious, not desperate. Calm. That calmness was the real success, because I realized something profound. The goal was never just money. Money was survival. Then it was validation. Then it became freedom. But true success was internal stability. There was one final test, though, and it wasn't financial. It was personal. During the years of rebuilding and scaling, I had sacrificed a lot. Late nights, missed family events, ignored friendships, constant mental pressure. One day, my mother said something simple. "You've become successful, but are you happy?" That question stayed with me, because success had consumed me once before. I didn't want to repeat the same mistake in a different form, so I redesigned my life the way I redesigned my business. I delegated more authority to senior team members. I reduced my operational involvement. I blocked non-negotiable personal time in my calendar. I invested in my health again. I rebuilt relationships I had neglected. Ironically, the business didn't suffer. It improved. Because a burned-out leader makes reactive decisions. A balanced leader makes strategic ones. Years after that dark room where I once sat feeling defeated, I walked into a conference room to close one of the largest deals of my career. The numbers were bigger than anything I had imagined at 27. But what mattered more was this. If the deal failed, I wouldn't collapse. If the deal succeeded, I wouldn't lose myself. That was the difference. I signed the contract. Not with shaking hands driven by fear, not with ego driven by pride, but with steady confidence. The journey from failure to success was never a straight line. It was humiliation, reflection, discipline, systems, leadership, resilience, balance. If I could summarize everything I learned, it would be this. Failure is not the opposite of success. Unanalyzed failure is. When you treat mistakes like information instead of identity, you gain power. When you build slowly instead of emotionally, you gain stability. When you separate your worth from your results, you gain freedom. And when you finally reach the level you once dreamed of, you realize something surprising. The real victory was not building the business. It was building yourself. Because businesses can collapse, markets can shift, money can disappear. But the disciplined, aware, resilient version of you, that stays. And once you know how to rebuild from nothing, you are never truly afraid again.